So this will mostly talk about kind of the New Deal and kind of the response. And you can pretty much read the slide. So I don't want to go into too much of the specifics about Hoover and Roosevelt because our focus is on the woman's history part of it. And so certainly if you have any specific questions about this, just, you can ask me at our next face-to-face class. Which is the Saturday before Thanksgiving. So let me kind of you can read this right here. So one of the biggest issues with Herbert Hoover, who is the president holding the bag when the stock market crash happens, is, how do we handle relief, right? And this really speaks to a problem that we see even today, which is, whose responsibility is it to respond to people in need? Is that a local problem? Is that a state problem? Is that a federal problem? And Republicans of that 1920s return to normalcy period, just like politicians in the Gilded Age, tended to take the attitude that it was up to individuals to be successful, right? That we have this great American economy and it works for everybody, and so if you really work hard, you can be successful. The problem with that is, of course, that ignores women, that ignores immigrants, that ignores people of color, that doesn't acknowledge the complexity of people's experiences. And of course, women are going to be women have that intersection in multiple ways, right? Particularly women of color have multiple intersections, even more so than white women or men of different ethnicities. And so I think that it's important to recognize that Hoover's response of, we shouldn't, the federal government shouldn't get that involved, all this kind of stuff, is really not enough for people. He will eventually kind of be forced, largely by Congress, into sending some money for emergency relief. But by the time that happens in 1932, it's too little too late. And by the time you get to 1932, you have a Dust Bowl that has taken place in the Great Plains. You have the farm region has overproduced, and they've depleted the soil, and that has created a huge problem. And so all of that is going to mean that people are really, really struggling by the time you get to 1932. And 1932 is going to be an election year. And so there's a cartoon of poor Herbert Hoover trying to quiet all the screaming children around. So that's a big problem. And then the other picture over here is from the Bonus Army March. So one of the interesting kind of anecdotes from this period of 1932 is you had a group of World War I veterans who, in the prosperity of the 1920s, had been promised a bonus for their service in World War I. Well, as is typical, veterans are unduly impacted by unemployment. And so there was a bill that was actually brought before by a Texas representative that suggested paying them the bonus early. Well, Herbert Hoover doesn't approve of that because to him, that's going to create a deficit for the federal government. And that's a bad thing, right? That we shouldn't do that. And so he basically refuses to support the bill. So you get a group of World War I veterans that march to Washington to kind of, demonstrate support for the bill. The bill fails in the Senate. Hoover won't meet with any of the veterans. And so they set up a shanty town, right? And they set up this shanty town in Washington, D.C. Hoover and the Washington, D.C. police decide this looks really bad in the nation's capital. So they go to clean it up, and it ends up resulting in violence and kind of a fire and all this kind of stuff. So that's from the Bonus Army that marched in 1932. So the American response to the Great Depression, and I touched on this a little bit already. You had the bank panics, right? And so you have even more banks closing. You have the Bonus Army March. Lots of people become homeless. So they create shanty towns, where you basically construct a shack out of whatever you can find, stray pieces of wood. They often start calling those Hoovervilles, and as kind of an insult to Herbert Hoover. You have hunger marches. The Communist Party becomes kind of not popular is the wrong word. They gain membership during this period. Lots of critique of capitalism, lots of critique of the capitalist system. Farmers destroying their products, trying to raise prices, which makes no sense. Why destroy agricultural products when people are going hungry? Why didn't the government just buy it and like distribute it? I don't know. Probably because that would have been too socialist. So you have lots of issues like that. You have, like I said, you have a lot of men that desert their families, and you have young men that leave their families trying to look for work. Sorry, my Yorkshire Terrier's barking. You have young men that leave their families, go looking for work. This is where hobos come from, right? This idea that of riding the rails and kind of, just being free and unencumbered. A lot of that has to do with the poverty of the Great Depression. Immigrants being deported, and all that kind of, this is the height of the film industry, right? Back then, going to the movies was relatively inexpensive. Now, obviously, if you were one of those people that was most significantly affected, you were homeless, you were going hungry, you didn't go to the movies. But so while you do have a significant portion, approximately 25%, of people that are affected in that kind of extreme way, you probably have a much larger percentage. You're probably talking 60%, 50% that are hurting, right? They don't have the same amount of money to spend that they used to. They can't buy the things they used to buy. They purchase things differently, but they have jobs. They have a home. They're not starving. They're not going totally hungry. And those people might be able to find a way to save up, 20 cents or save up 15 cents to go to the movies. And so that's where that kind of comes in, why cinema becomes such a big deal during the 1930s. Because if you were, part of the half or slight majority of the country that isn't doing well, but can scrape together a little money to have some resources, then you might be able to enjoy the movies, right? Radio becomes very popular too, largely because, remember, the 1920s, radio was a big deal. And so you had a lot of people buying, who had bought radios, and those people were, were able to listen to, soap operas and that kind of thing. So lots of pictures. So this kind of shows you some of what I mean. You have bread lines, people waiting in bread lines to get food. This picture, of course, is incredibly ironic about the American way. And then you've got those people standing in a bread line. This one, hobos, next time, try the train. This picture down here shows you a dust bowl. Children are hugely affected by this. Lost educational opportunities, poor nutrition. One of the challenges when we go into World War II is that you'd had a lot of people that were malnourished, that needed to have proper nutrition in order to be ready to go fight. So the lost educational opportunities, all these things are a really big deal eventually. But, it's really sad to kind of see, the conditions the kids lived in. And then this is a famous picture called The Migrant Mother, of a woman whose family had been affected by the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl sweeps through the Great Plains, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, even into the Texas Panhandle. And these farms that were already on the verge of collapse, right, that were already struggling. There's no rain. The topsoil's been depleted. You have these massive dust storms. And so people can't pay their bills. And so they have to pack up and move away. And you have some people moving into cities to get jobs, but you have a lot of people that will migrate to California, because California's agriculture is doing okay. And so part of the deportation of Mexican and Mexican Americans during this period is because you have, native-born white Americans or African Americans moving to California seeking work. And so there's going to be this bias towards hiring them. And so lots of really kind of sad migration going on during this period. This picture of the migrant mother, what's particularly sad about this is she's had to sell the tires to her car in order to buy food for her kids. So really kind of a dramatic story. So Dorothea Lange documents that quite a bit. So this is why they call it the Great Depression. It's pretty depressing. And you have women, like I said, that they're being, dealing with abandonment. They're dealing with, just trying to hold the family together. And so there's a lot of struggles, and even families that are together, trying to keep keep the mortgage paid, trying to, to come up with creative ways to make food. I know my mother-in-law has a recipe that goes back from the Great Depression. It's called an Osgood pie, and it's made with some pecans, but raisins and dried bread. And so instead of using flour, right, you could use your leftover bread, let it dry out, and then you crush it up into this pie. So we make it every holiday as kind of a commemoration for my husband's family. But its origin is in the Great Depression when people didn't have money. And so like you didn't want to waste your dry bread. So you turn it, how can we turn this into something, and pecans, especially if you're around Texas, you can get your hands on some pecans. And so just lots of ways in which people were able to, little subtle ways that kind of comes in. I know my dad remembers, my dad's in his 80s, so he was a child during the Great Depression. He remembers having holes in his shoes and having to put cardboard in them. And to this day, still collects spare change because, if something ever went wrong, he'd always have that spare change. So like my dad in particular was affected by it. So it's just kind of interesting if you ever get a chance to know anybody that can remember. Of course, most of the people that were adults during that period, most, if not all, have passed away. So the only people you would run into would be people who are in their 80s, right, that remember being kids during this time period. But it's pretty shocking to hear stories about what that was like. So anyways, that covers kind of the conditions of the Great Depression. So when you're talking about, the big kind of narrative, the big narrative here has to do with FDR. And FDR, of course, is this new president that comes in. What's most notable about him is he was disabled, right? He had polio in 1921. He ran he was a vice presidential nominee in 1920. Of course, the Democrats lose. And after that election, he comes down with polio and loses the use of his legs. Now, he's eventually able to sort of stand with the use of braces. And so one of the interesting little side notes about him is that the press really didn't show him in a wheelchair. There's only like 2 pictures of him actually in a wheelchair. But he was absolutely disabled. And so he kind of comes into the forefront because of his actions as New York governor, promoting a really robust relief program in the state of New York. And so as we're going into 1932, the Democrats really hone in on him as being the clear candidate. And he says, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. And his speech, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, right? And he comes out and says, we're going to do something about this. We're going to treat this economic depression as though it were a war. We're going to put everything we have into it. And so he brings a level of optimism and a desire to experiment and find a solution, right? We're going to keep doing things until we figure this out. Now, from a women's history perspective, what's interesting is the idea of Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt is his wife. They were distant cousins, actually, which is kind of weird. But she is a new type of first lady. He's crippled, so he pretty much stays in Washington, D.C. So she does a lot of traveling, and kind of is really his feet on the ground. No, disability, pun intended. And she definitely kind of reaches out to people, and she is very progressive. She's very, she resigns her membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution because they won't let Marian Anderson sing in one of their buildings. And this leads to the famous scene of Marian Anderson, an African-American opera singer, singing, the national anthem at the Lincoln Memorial. And so Eleanor Roosevelt, she was known for standing up for immigrants. She was known for standing up for children. She was, a real activist in her own way. And so she's very, very active in kind of promoting these. And so she and Roosevelt have kind of an interesting relationship where she really kind of goes out and kind of collects the information, collects what's happening with people, comes back, would write letters and memos to Roosevelt. He would read them, and you can see where her letters maybe didn't have exact policy outcomes, but they certainly influenced the direction that he went. They very much have a political marriage. It's not a happy marriage in the classic romantic sense of the word, but it is a very viable, kind of efficient marriage. He was kind of a player, even as a disabled person, had several mistresses. And they basically slept in separate bedrooms, and she did her thing and he did his, but they had this kind of political arrangement where they got things done politically. And she was absolutely the more kind of activist, the more progressive. A lot of times he would let her say and do things that he actually agreed with, but she would say and do them, and then he would kind of test it out with her. And if the reaction was bad, then he would kind of, well, she's a woman, what you gonna do, And people would say, oh, well, she's just the first lady. So it's kind of interesting how their relationship works, politically speaking. The big thing about the New Deal is you've got a major kind of the whole presidential idea of the first 100 days that you have to get a bunch of legislation done comes from this period, right? Because you had 15 pieces of legislation pushed through in the first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration. And his ability to communicate with people was pretty significant. And he has a series. You've got reform movements, you've got relief to the people, and you've got recovery for the economy. And we could spend an entire semester just talking about the New Deal, right? Suffice it to say, the big things about the economic reforms are going to be the Glass-Steagall Act that kind of separates investment banks that invest deposits from commercial banks that are traditional where they don't invest your deposits. The creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, so you never have to worry again about a bank closing and your money just disappearing. The Securities and Exchange Act that creates the SEC. So those are major pieces of reform. You have major relief that goes to the people, the Public Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration, the CCC, the CWA. These are all a variety of programs that are meant to help people. Now, these programs are not perfect. Things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, is a program that's designed to help just young men, unmarried men. So it doesn't help young single women get work, doesn't help African Americans, male or female. You have, the PWA, does actually kind of is able to put some requirements for people. What they do is they give out contracts for jobs, and then those companies get the contract, and they are able to put into those agreements that they have to hire a certain number of African Americans. But you still have most of the relief going directly to people who are white. African Americans are disproportionately hurt in that process. Although you will see that towards the end of by the time you get to the 36, 37, 38, there does seem to be some attention being shifted to, we need to find ways to help African American communities. So there does seem to be some attempts maybe later on to kind of remedy some of that. But there's definitely, African Americans do not benefit as much from the New Deal as white people do. But the concept of relief, that the government goes into debt, the government just spends money in order to get money into people's hands so they can eat, they can have a place to live, they can participate in the economy, it becomes a big deal. The other thing that you see is recovery efforts, things like the Tennessee Valley Association to electrify the South and create a series of dams. You have, laws about unions. Two of the ones that you want to be familiar with is the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Acts. These are notable because they are both eventually declared unconstitutional, that it was too much government interference. The Blue Eagle campaign is part of the NRA. Basically, the government would set wages and prices, and companies that agreed to follow that could put Blue Eagles on all their stuff. And the Supreme Court comes out and says, no, that's basically the government endorsing certain companies, and they can't do that. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was paying farmers not to grow things. And the Supreme Court comes back and says, no, the government can't tell people what to grow and what not to grow. Probably the biggest outcome of the first New Deal is going to be the Social Security Act of 1935. This is intended to kind of provide kind of an old age insurance is how they sold it. But basically, we pay a tax, we pay into it, and it's meant to give us benefits when we're older, or if we die, our children can inherit our minor children under the age of 18 can inherit or receive our benefits. If you become disabled, that kind of thing. The most important thing I would say is it's not a handout, because Social Security is something we pay taxes, so we've already paid for it. And it definitely kind of puts this relationship of the federal government, right? That people begin to expect certain things from their federal government. And certainly we've seen that we have been unable, like Social Security is a permanent fixture of our economy now. And if you talk about getting rid of it, people, really get upset. So it's kind of an interesting response of the New Deal. There are lots of unintended consequences with it, but fundamentally it's kind of a new dramatic change. This shows you what I mean by the Blue Eagle advertisement campaign, all this kind of stuff. So lots of dramatic change. Now, one of the critics of his administration is that he wasn't going far enough, that unemployment was too high, that wages were staying too low, and that we weren't getting out of this depression. So you had some people coming from the left that said he wasn't going far enough. You had some people that said he was going too far. And so you have the same old debate that we have now, which is, how do you respond to this situation? Do we have too much government, or do we need to, oppose deficit spending and oppose big government? So you've got kind of this division going on, about how to respond to this. And it's into this that the Supreme Court declares the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Recovery Administration unconstitutional. And this is going to make FDR pretty upset. And he's going to begin a campaign to kind of restructure the Supreme Court. That's going to begin to really take place around 1936. So this is kind of, as you get to the end of the first New Deal, as you get to the end of his first term in 1936, this is kind of where things are, where you've had some dramatic programs that have begun to help people, but you still have a lingering depression, right? And so one of the other big things that happens with FDR is a 1936 presidential election. He wins in a landslide because he creates a new coalition of voters that include women primarily, right? Not primarily, women in part, African Americans, a whole range of people from very progressive to people that, resent corporate influence. And Eleanor Roosevelt is a huge part of building up this coalition, right? So she brings in these voters. And so this is going to kind of usher in a second New Deal. And so you're going to have, Americans really endorsing FDR. However, he has lost support in Congress, right? So the critiques, he's gone too far, he's not gone far enough. He loses some support in Congress, and that's going to make his second New Deal a little slower. And so in the midst of his second New Deal, he deals with the Supreme Court. He's dealing with a recession within the Depression. You'll have a reauthorization of the WPA and the PWA. Court packing scheme, again, doesn't really have a whole lot to do with women per se, but it is a major event in FDR's administration where he tries to restructure the Supreme Court. This will ultimately kind of hurt his reputation for 1938. So one of the problems he faces in 1938 is that he's losing some support in Congress. And in part because during the election year, he kind of responded to the criticisms by cutting some funding for some programs. And this happens at the same time that they're taking out Social Security taxes. So here we are in the midst of a depression that we haven't gotten out of, and the economy slows down again in what they call the Roosevelt recession. And so this is going to be part of, again, part of the debate. And he's going to come down very solidly on the side of deficit spending, right? In part because Eleanor Roosevelt in her travels is going to come back and say, you don't know how people are living. And so he's going to really embrace that we need money for housing. We need money for these new programs. And so ultimately what we're going to see is that that the most action for FDR takes place in his first administration with the Recovery Relief Reform business, the Social Security Act. and we'll see that his second administration is really going to start to get taken over by what's happening globally, right? That what's happening overseas. Now, the midterm elections of 1938, we'll see Republicans gain more seats in Congress, but the issues in Europe are beginning to kind of push the economic concerns to the back a little bit. And what we can say is that he does end up being able to nominate judges to the Supreme Court. His attempt to restructure the court fails, but a bunch of justices retire. And you have this whole new relationship of the government to people, the government in the economy, right? And we still deal with a lot of aspects of the New Deal. And so kind of the last thing I want to leave you with is, we're focused primarily on women, but you want to kind of know that what else is happening in the 1930s while, Franklin and Eleanor are doing their thing and, trying to make the United States better. You're going to see that you have totalitarianism increasing. Japan invades China. Japan invades Korea, what will become Vietnam. They were pretty upset about World War I, and so they start becoming very imperialistic. Italy has embraced fascism. Russia, which in World War I had fallen to communism as the Soviet Union, Stalin's in power. And in Germany, Hitler comes to power, right? He becomes the Fuhrer. And so the Japan, Italy, and Germany, because they're very anti-communist, they will kind of create an alliance. And then Germany will have that non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. And this will ultimately lead to the invasion of Poland in 1939, and the invasion of France and the air attacks on Britain by 1940. So while all of that is going on, all the New Deal stuff is happening here at home, you have a lot of crazy things happening overseas. So if you want to know more about that, you can ask me specifically in class. I don't want to talk about it if you feel like you already kind of know it. There's a lot about kind of the rise of totalitarianism that is, available out there. So you may be much more familiar with it. I do want to talk about FDR responding to totalitarianism. You have really in the United States a series of neutrality acts trying to keep us out of this kind of what's happening in Europe. And you have even kind of a Nazi party in the United States called the America First Committee. And so you have a series, you have this debate going on from 1938 really until, December 7th, 1941. And the U.S. never adjusts its immigration policies from the 1921, 1924 immigration restrictions. So when the Holocaust, the Holocaust, when Germany starts targeting Jews in Europe, we don't let Jews come over here, really. We kind of handpick, we'll take Einstein, but we're not just going to take anybody. So kind of that nativism, in fact, I would argue this is part of why we soften our stance on immigration by 1965 is because, we didn't do this in going into 1940. FDR will kind of push the country towards preparedness, particularly with the Lend-Lease Act that will kind of cause, basically, we have to be the arsenal of democracy. Britain's at war with Germany. We have to supply them. And most Americans will begin to kind of buy into that. And this military spending will actually bring about the end of the Great Depression, right? So as we do the Lend-Lease Act in 1940, as the Selective Service Act begins in the summer of 1940, that begins to significantly lower unemployment. It begins to put money into the economy. You start to have more and more people employed, and we start to see the end to the Great Depression, largely because of these responses. FDR will win in November of 1940. So as we're going into 1941, he's become president for a third term, which is highly unusual. That was, it was a standard for presidents to only serve 2 terms. FDR, challenges that standard. And then, what will happen is in 1952, we passed the 22nd Amendment that limits presidents to 2 terms. So you have FDR kind of becoming president again. And then it's on December 7th, 1941 that you have Pearl Harbor happening. So that's really kind of the essence of the 1930s. Again, when you're talking about women, you've got Eleanor Roosevelt as a big factor. Women benefiting from the New Deal. Women did benefit, not as much as men. right? The New Deal is really, the jobs are really targeted towards men. The only perhaps exception you could make would be the WPA. The WPA does employ like artists and writers and stuff. And so you have a lot of women that are able to get employment through that. But when you're talking about the real kind of manual work jobs, the construction jobs, women didn't have access to that. So the impact of the New Deal on women is somewhat limited because women just the jobs that were out there weren't for them. But overall, most women, if they thought about the politics at all, they liked FDR. Eleanor certainly was an important figure, but you still had women that didn't like her, that thought she was, too busy, too much out there, too much involved in stuff. So she faced criticism as well as praise, right? So it's kind of hard. You don't want to kind of lump all women in together. This is really kind of an extension of what we talked about with kind of the Great Depression, which is that this is a period where it's not that women aren't affected. They're profoundly affected by what's happening. But the programs are not targeted to them because of their role in society from the 1920s and 1930s, which is largely in support positions, right? Either support in the job in the workforce or support at home. They deal with the consequences, but we don't always necessarily notice what they're dealing with. So that's kind of one of the interesting elements of women during the Great Depression. But that's going to change as we move into World War II.